Welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, August 17th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the New York Times and Siena College releasing their final set of swing state polls they've done this cycle right before the first presidential debate. The Democratic National Convention is also 3 days away, and we are right ahead of some very, very important turning point moments for the Democratic and Republican campaigns of this election. And so the New York Times released polls recently, last week actually, across states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, but now they're focusing on the Sun Belt. We talked about how this election very often has 7 core battleground states: Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. And it is these states that really dictate the future of this nation. Back in 2020, the electoral map was far expanded. Not only were Democrats focused on those 7 states, they were also focused on states like Iowa and Ohio and Florida, and in some circumstances, even Texas. And in terms of playing defense based on the 2016 election, Democrats had also allocated a lot of funding, and Republicans too, to states like Minnesota and Virginia and New Hampshire and Colorado, because they believed that this cycle in 2020, all things were on the table. But what we learned very quickly after the 2020 election, despite what the polls were predicting, and despite what many pundits who were from the Obama era who had said Ohio's back in play, Iowa's back in play, Democrats really narrowed in their focus on 7 crucial battleground states this cycle. When it looked like Donald Trump was on track for a very solid victory, however, he expanded his map. The Trump campaign announced that they were going to be opening up campaign field offices in states like Minnesota and Virginia, and they were looking all across the country for where they could expand on the electoral map rather than focus on the states they needed to win in the election. And so Democrats never really changed from that. And so Democrats have been spending tens of millions of dollars across the battleground states, but it was never really paying off under Joe Biden. It very much was as if they were just throwing money at the wall and nothing was shifting in terms of public opinion. But then under Kamala Harris, when she came into it, she has now put all of these states very, very, very far back into play, especially by the standards of the New York Times and Siena College. Why? Because they actually released polls back in May and June that were pre-debate, all these calls for Biden to drop out, which means that those polls afterwards looked far, far, far worse for the Democratic Party. But they released polls earlier on that showed Joe Biden in a really abysmal position when it came down to his numbers in these battleground states. And so now, as we're starting to see that she is gaining in the Sun Belt and starting to really realign demographic patterns, as the New York Times now calling it normal, which makes sense. That's the way we've seen it in years past and wasn't really seeing that for Joe Biden. It really makes sense that her making these gains in the swing states and in the Sunbelt states has now completely changed the way that Democrats and Republicans look at this electoral map. The Trump campaign now going back on their promises and even closing some campaign field offices in states that they otherwise were focusing on, otherwise were going to be spending money on and investing in. Donald Trump even holding campaign rallies in the Bronx of New York City, holding campaign rallies in Wildwood in New Jersey. You know, when we think about Donald Trump and trying to expand his electoral map, he was going very, very far. But this time, because Kamala Harris has now made this massive rebound, they are now focusing on these states. But Kamala Harris is now doing well in a way that simply Joe Biden was not. I'll show you those comparable numbers in just a moment, but I want you to see where we are right now. The question was, if the 2024 presidential election were held today, who would you vote for if the candidates were Kamala Harris and Donald Trump? The big one for Kamala Harris is Arizona, where she takes a 5-point lead, which actually stands, and this is an A-plus poll, so I really do think the New York Times and Siena College does have some level of validity. The many of these C, D-rated pollsters, especially the ones that come from partisan camps, even Democrat or Republican, I really don't like to use campaign internals unless they're showing their own campaign losing, because then it's really bad luck. But beyond that, what we find here is that they are saying Arizona is a 5-point lead for Kamala Harris, which isn't too far off what Democrats won by in the Senate race in 2022. And given Ruben Gallego doing extremely well in the Arizona Senate race, and not to mention that these Senate numbers here look really bad for Republicans when compared side to side with Kamala Harris, it makes Kamala Harris look like she's being obliterated, but in reality, she's winning across these battleground states. Arizona, a 5-point lead is very strong for Kamala Harris. The next real big shocker, and I think this is the one that really gets me, is showing Kamala Harris with a 2-point advantage in North Carolina. Because now it isn't just the New York Times saying it. It is multiple other pollsters across the board saying North Carolina is far more competitive than where it was. Because under Biden and Trump, it was Biden being down 6-7 points. Now, Harris on average is running roughly even with Donald Trump in a state that Biden couldn't even win back in 2020. That matters. Now, Nevada has narrowed down to a 1-point race. And I know it's not great for Kamala Harris. I'm not trying to spin this in favor of Kamala Harris by saying she's down 1 point, but what I will say is that what we've seen from Nevada very consistently is that Democrats have not taken the lead once. Biden has never been up in a poll in Nevada. Kamala Harris has seen a few. This is now another one from the New York Times showing her very close to Donald Trump. And I actually buy this number a lot more. I think Nevada's been a state that I've been very particular about. In my last prediction, I moved it from lean Dem to tilt Dem because I think it's a lot narrower than we think and a lot more likely to go to Donald Trump than we think. But right now, my personal prediction has Kamala Harris up very narrowly. But what we see here, 48 to 47, is that Donald Trump has a very narrow advantage of just 1 point. Georgia is the real sucker here for Democrats. It's a state that they were hoping that Kamala Harris, with realigned voting bases from the Democratic base, Asian American voters, black voters, in states like Georgia, were really going to narrow down the race in favor of Kamala Harris. So far, we have not seen that. Seen that from the New York Times, but we have seen on the average, prior to this poll, the New York Times not being factored in. So taking this out of the equation, the average of polls in Georgia right now had Kamala Harris up by 0.1%. So this 4-point poll for Trump is going to throw this about to a Trump 1, Trump 2 lead on average. But Georgia, I will say too, was the state of the 2020 cycle that Biden won by the least. The one in the 2022 cycle, the Democrats saw the least of strong performances in when they were talking about swing states they won. If you take in Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all these other states into account, Georgia was the one where, given the candidates, given the cards they were dealt, they saw the least, what is the word? Why am I losing the word for this? The least impressive. I don't know why it took me so long to grab that word. Impressive performance in this state. They were running against Herschel Walker, who had no elected experience, had so many scandals. His own son, Christian Walker, and I know you guys might remember him from TikTok or Twitter, whatever it might be, for his very, very outlandish videos, but he was very against his own dad becoming United States Senator. And so there's so many different things that had come out, abuse of his family, attacking his wife. These are all things that had come out during the campaign, and it became a very negative thing, and yet Raphael Warnock only won by 2 points in the runoff. And so I will say Georgia has been a bit more tricky for Democrats because even in the more extreme of cases, even 2020, even you look at the margin of victory there, it was just 11,000 votes. 11,000 votes out of 5 million votes cast. So Georgia has never been this, really tried and tested Democrat state. Democrats have gotten lucky in Georgia, but even in those circumstances, their margins are amongst the narrowest. And so this actually makes quite sense. But when you take a look at the comparison to Joe Biden, it is like night and day for Kamala Harris in comparison to Biden. Because what we have found is that in the recent polls, Kamala Harris leads by 4 points in Wisconsin, 4 points in Pennsylvania, 4 points in Michigan. Compared to Biden, he was up 2 in Wisconsin. Strong numbers, but still less than Kamala Harris. Down 3 in Pennsylvania, and down 7 in Michigan. Kamala Harris has completely reversed Pennsylvania and Michigan's direction in favor of the Democrats and expanded the lead in Wisconsin. But don't get me started on Arizona, which went from being a Trump plus 7 state to a Kamala Harris plus 5 state. That is a 12-point swing in the span of 3 months. Why? Because of the new presidential nominee. When you take a look, too, at Georgia, which has gone from a state that Donald Trump was up 10 points against Joe Biden. Now, Kamala Harris is down in the state, but only by 4, putting it certainly back into play. 10 points was never really in play. And I will say, I don't know if Donald Trump was ever going to win Georgia by 10 points, but the lack of willingness from polled Democrats and independents to even cite Joe Biden as an option, as the person they were voting for in the election, was really indicative of the lack of enthusiasm and excitement for the race. I still think Joe Biden would have lost Georgia by 2, 3, 4 points, but not by 10. But this was an indicator, a heavy indicator, that he was never going to come into this position where he was going to narrow up this race enough to have Democrats confident about his chances at victory, which is why when that first debate happened, he needed to reassure Democrats he could do it. He didn't do that. And so everybody said, you need to get out of the race. He couldn't come back in time to say, I'm actually in it to win it. I can win this race. And while I don't deny that in some circumstance, Joe Biden would have maybe a 20, 25% chance of victory and that he could have won because things with the fourth chance of happening happen all the time. But it wasn't going to be super strong. It wasn't going to be in a position where Joe Biden and the Democrats could have gone on election night to that watch party and said, I am confident some blue balloons will drop this evening and that we will win this election. Because arguably, they had no reason to be confident because Joe Biden's numbers were not strong. Kamala Harris's, however, were far stronger and are far stronger. And the final state we can look at here is Nevada, which again, the entire time of this election, Donald Trump has been decimating Joe Biden in Nevada. Not a singular poll ever in the cycle had Joe Biden up in Nevada. Donald Trump was leading him by 12 in the state. Kamala Harris is down 1. So an 11-point swing in Nevada, an 11-point swing in Nevada, a 6-point swing in Georgia. And North Carolina, we can actually take a look at here. I don't believe they have the numbers here on the New York Times poll, Siena College, but that's an improvement for Kamala Harris nonetheless because the averages had her down. And in Arizona, again, what we have seen is that Biden was down 7, Harris is up 5. That is a 12-point swing. So, to recap, Where were we? Again, back to the Joe Biden numbers, 12-point swing in Arizona, 11-point swing in Nevada, and a 6-point swing in Georgia. All around very, very, very positive numbers for the Democratic ticket, given how little of time they've had to campaign. I mean, they have not even been in this race for a month. Joe Biden dropped out of the race less than a month ago, to give you an understanding of how fast these numbers have changed in favor of the Democrats. And if we were just to take this at face value, the numbers from the New York Times A-rated poll, and apply it to our Electoral College map here. I'm just going to do the Democrat numbers because that's all you really need to see. We're going to give them all the states they won by 5 or more in 2020, so we can use this as a baseline. If we were to take the numbers that we just saw from the results, if we were just to say the New York Times numbers, if we were to apply that, what we would find is this. Democrats would win in Wisconsin, they would win in Michigan, they would win in Pennsylvania. That alone brings them to 270 electoral votes. But what do we know? Kamala Harris's numbers are better in Arizona than they are in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Kamala Harris, in theory, leads by 2 in North Carolina. A map like this, Democrats don't need anything else. Sure, it'd be nice for them to win Georgia and Nevada and in some crazy reality, Texas or Florida. But that isn't going to happen, at least seemingly right now, according to the New York Times. But that doesn't matter. An election victory for Kamala Harris, I never think is going to expand beyond 300 electoral votes. I think she's in this race for a very, very close and competitive one, which is why Democrats know this map isn't about expansion. In 2020, Democrats certainly came into this race with a level of confidence that in no reality would any, in their eyes, reasonable Democrat or reasonable independent vote for Donald Trump over Joe Biden. That they just simply wouldn't. That Joe Biden is the vice president under President Obama, who has a record high approval rating during the 2016 and 2020 elections. People adore Joe Biden. His favorabilities were very strong coming into the primary, dipped a little bit after the primary season, but rebounded right before the election. And all the metrics have said Biden was up 8 in Wisconsin, right? Up 7 in Michigan, up 6 in Pennsylvania. And in 2020, especially during COVID, that shy Trump effect was in full force in the same way it was in 2016, but not really in the same way we see in 2024. We'll talk about that in a future video. But what we saw there was that Democrats seemingly came into the 2020 election right on election day, assuming this election was going to be locked up and wrapped up tonight. Very clearly was not. The 2020 election ended up being far closer than some Democrats had hoped for, in the same way that Van Jones had said on CNN that many Democrats were hoping there would be a complete and total rejection of Donald Trump's leadership and Donald Trump's policies. But there wasn't. Florida ended up being more conservative. Ohio and Iowa didn't go back to where they were under Obama. In fact, 13 points away where they were under Obama. And so these states here, Democrats narrowing it up to these 7 battleground states also means a concentration of a $1 billion campaign that won them in 2020 when spread out across 10 to 12 states has now narrowed down to 7. The Trump team, while still pulling out some of their states like Virginia and Minnesota, they still very much want to win those states, and they're still going to fight for them and waste money on those states. But we know with Kamala Harris, they're not winning those states. So Democrats having these 7 states that are really concentrated, especially under a likable candidate like Kamala Harris, who has a much, much better approval rating than Joe Biden, has rebounded her national image. She has become someone who people adore rather than just thought of when thinking about a Biden-Harris administration. The second name to be rung off. Now, it's all about Kamala, all about Tim, all about her ticket. Them as people, America's dad, America's aunt, people who they've become people who people adore, people like, people want to vote for, people are excited to vote for. Look at her crowd sizes compared to Joe Biden's. Look at the enthusiasm compared to Joe Biden's. And while I don't think their electoral performances would be drastically different, they are different enough that it means all the difference between losing and winning. And in this election, that is all that matters for the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris gaining these numbers in the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt go to show that her level of electability really is unrivaled in comparison to Joe Biden. She does so much better in the Rust Belt and in the Sun Belt. And that is being translated to these margins of victories. 5 points in Arizona is very strong for Kamala Harris. 2 points in North Carolina would be breathtaking for the Democratic Party should they win North Carolina on election night. It's so far out of the fray that North Carolina has been a state the Democrats have only won once in the 21st century, and that was in 2008 when they won by 14,000 votes. Even states like Indiana, which are now Trump plus 20 states, went for Obama more in 2008 than North Carolina did. And I get it. Circumstances are different. In North Carolina, in theory, the demographics are more favorable for the Democratic Party. But if Kamala Harris becomes the first Democrat that can break through to North Carolina since Obama, it will completely assure the Democrats of those claims that she is bringing back 2008 type of energy. Not energy that Hillary Clinton had, and certainly not energy that many Democrats, could try to argue that Joe Biden had in 2020. Granted, we didn't have rallies, we didn't have the same type of structure of a campaign, and maybe those are things that hinder the way we look at it. But there was very much a very, very clear settle for Joe Biden campaign. Let's just vote for Joe Biden because he's not Donald Trump campaign. This race is all about for Kamala Harris and against Donald Trump. A combination of factors that could be really, really deadly to the Trump campaign. And that's exactly what we're seeing in these polls, even before a convention bump, even before a first debate bump. Two things that we entirely expect to see for the Republican Party this cycle, for the Democratic Party this cycle, because of the way the race has been set up between Vice President Harris and Donald Trump. But all in all, the New York Times numbers are very good for the Democratic Party. And they show that the gains in the Sun Belt have become more consistent and look normal when we're talking about the national level, which is a very good thing for Kamala Harris. Because the New York Times polls are correct, and they are A+, Siena College does them as well, A+, 297 electoral votes for Kamala Harris, which is the victory the Democrats would be proud of to see on election night. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist of my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.